Welcome to another in the series of Perth USAsia Centre Foreign Policy Conversations, today focused on cybersecurity in the new world. The advent of the virtual world in which we're all living right now, at one point promised to completely divorce ourselves from reality. Unfortunately, I think the overlay of the COVID-19 era, where many of us are homebound, has actually reinforced our connection to country. As such, it is important that as is the tradition of the Perth USAsia Centre and the University of Western Australia, begin events like this, even if it is just virtually, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. In our case, the Noongar people of the Whadjuk people, rather, of the Noongar Nation here in Western Australia. We pay our respects to their leaders, past, present, and future. Even just 6 months ago, if you had looked at the 7 years of content that is on the Perth USAsia Centre website and typed in virus, I think you might have been lucky to have one reference to a physical virus, and most of the focus would have been on cyber viruses, computer viruses, and the previous events we've done in cybersecurity. And yet, despite the world-changing nature of the COVID-19 pandemic, the various threats associated with cybersecurity, the various policy challenges around cybersecurity haven't gone away. If anything, they've actually increased. So in that context, we're very fortunate today to have two wonderful discussants to kind of discuss the issues surrounding cybersecurity, implications for Australia, for the Indo-Pacific more broadly, and for the globe, and to help us frame our own thinking about these issues as we go forward. To begin with, we're delighted today to welcome Danielle Cave. Danielle is the Deputy Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI's International Cyber Policy Centre. In 2016, Danielle was a Google Policy Fellow attached to the Harvard University's incubated Digital Asia Hub in Hong Kong. She's a PhD scholar at the Coral Bell School of the Asia Pacific Affairs at ANU, a former analyst and team leader in the Open Source Center at the Office of National Assessments. And in 2009 to 2012, she worked as a research associate at Lowy, and previous to that, actually, with some ties to Japan, working for the Yomiuri Shimbun. For the purpose of us today, you'd be hard-pressed to Google cyber in Australia in the last 6 months or two or 3 years, rather, and not find Danielle's kind of word come up. She's been an important voice in the dialogue here. And we're very fortunate to have you join us today. Danielle, thank you. We appreciate it. Glad to have you. We're also delighted to have Professor Stephen Smith. Professor Smith is Professor of Public and International Law here at the University of Western Australia. He's a distinguished fellow and a member of the board of the Perth USAsia Centre, also chairman of the Defence and Security Committee at the University of Western Australia, and chairman of the advisory board of the Public Policy Institute here. Of particularly relevance to our discussion today, Stephen serves as chairman of the board of Sapien Cyber, and previously was chairman of the board, and now is a strategic advisor to the Canberra-based firm Arctis. As I think most of our audience will know, Professor Smith was a federal member for Perth, and in a decades-long career in public service, served for over 20 years as, again, not just a member of Perth, but as a Minister of Defense, and prior to that, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. And we're delighted to have Stephen join us, in this case, not just as a member of the board, but as an issue area specialist, and we're delighted to have this conversation. So Stephen, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Gordon.
Danielle, I think we might start out with you. You've written a lot on this topic today that we're discussing today. I'm wondering if you might just help us frame it from your perspective and your priority perspective in a world where we're all concerned with lockdowns, with flattening the curve, with whether or not we should wear masks, what's going on in Victoria. There doesn't seem to be a lot of bandwidth to be paying attention to cybersecurity, and yet there's an awful lot happening in that space. So could you just start off by telling us, what are you focused on? What are your concerns? Yeah. What are the developments that we should be paying attention to and that we should know about now?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time, I think, to be a part of this sort of cyber technology, and I put information in this basket as well. But it's completely exhausting as well, because every day there's something new. Even if you look at President Trump's executive order that I think came in on Friday on TikTok and WeChat. It's just at the moment never ending. If I think about the team we have at ASPI is about 30 people, and everybody works on really different topics. But broadly, I think this field is changing a lot under COVID-19, and I think geopolitics at the moment has never been more important, and that's, I think, preoccupying a lot of our time. So that combination, I think, of COVID-19 and geopolitics, and it's a bit corny, but it really is accelerating and sharpening, I think, a lot of the trends we were seeing pre-pandemic, whether it be cyber criminals taking advantage of all of us as we move into a work from home environment. And, you know, some of us are back at work, but at home more, and preparing, I think, to go back into a more work from home environment. So, you know, they're using phishing emails and text messages and that sort of thing. And at the same time, we have cyber espionage actors out there looking for a whole range of bits and pieces, whether it be fulfilling collection priorities around, you know, how you know, militaries, you know, how are the militaries in our region coping? How are politicians coping with this? What are the trade deals that are occurring at the moment? And, you know, a lot of them are out there collecting IP about COVID vaccinations, about strategic technologies. There's a whole range of things going on. And I think the interesting part of this is that this is occurring at a time when we are more vulnerable, as I said, because we're working from home. We're seeing global and domestic impacts of a more assertive China, who is engaging in foreign interference, including online disinformation campaigns, which is a new thing they've added to their toolkit mostly this year. And we're seeing you know, growing US-China tensions. And a lot of those tensions are around technology and cyber issues, which is why I think it's so interesting. And I'd encourage people actually to, Brendan Thomas Noon at the US Studies Centre, which is your sort of sister centre, right, in Sydney, has written a paper about this, looking at how technology really is front and centre of US-China tensions. As I said before, every day there are new developments coming out of the White House that I think many people would say just a few months ago you would not predict. We had some conversations in the office a couple of months ago about whether the White House would look at banning TikTok, and we all thought, no, there's lots of other steps to take before leapfrogging to that stage. And then a few weeks ago, a couple of us were like, actually, we can see that happening, and that's a really major move. Well, I mentioned to you before, I think one of the really interesting things was you can look at the different ministers and how the communiques they're putting out with different bilateral partners are changing over time. So as I mentioned to you before, I did this word cloud comparing OSMIN this year with OSMIN 10 years ago when Stephen was Defence Minister. And it was fascinating looking at, you know, cyber was mentioned a bit, but it was technology. It was critical technologies, critical minerals, critical infrastructure, resilience, 5G, information came up a lot more. And that's, you know, a lot of that is being driven, I think, by the Defence Minister and the Foreign Minister. And these topics are all sort of new and emerging topics that just a few years ago, they really didn't have to put a lot of resourcing into.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Stephen, Danielle highlighted a lot of the consumer-fronted elements of this, you know, with the working from home, the new risk associated with that, even up to the date information coming out of Washington with apps like TikTok and how they're being brought into thing. Your experience, obviously, as a government minister, and now on the corporate side of thing, also pulls in the deeper national security elements associated with this. So would you kind of, taking your current experiences and your previous experiences, tell us the framing that you use to understand the world we live in right now vis-a-vis cyber?
Well, a lot of what Daniel had to say, I agree with, particularly sort of COVID-19 bringing into sharp relief things which were occurring anyway. But a lot has changed and happened over the last decade in cybersecurity. And when I was minister from 2010 to 2013, we were really just starting to scratch the surface then that cyber was more than just about governments protecting its own apparatus. It was spreading much more generally and broadly to business and industry, but also to individual consumers. To me, I think the most important development that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years when it comes to cyber has been the extent to which we've started to focus on protection of critical infrastructure and the way in which exposure to critical infrastructure, whether it's transport system, whether it's energy systems, can really cripple a nation if they're not adequately and appropriately protected by government. And if you look at a range of policy approaches that the Australian Parliament and the government have effected over the last couple of years, we've seen much more of a focus on critical infrastructure than we have in the past. And indeed, whilst if Danielle's doing her sort of word cloud searches of AUSMIN from 2010 to 2013 to now in the last few years, you'll get some crossover with cybersecurity. But I would be surprised, without having refreshed my memory, if you got a crossover with critical infrastructure. It's really only been in much more recent times where foreign investment into critical infrastructure and the capacity for cyber attacks or cyber misuse of critical infrastructure has come to the fore. And I think that will continue to be one of the most significant areas of detailed policy attention so far as the Australian government is concerned, and that's sort of flagged without expressly saying so in the recent cybersecurity strategy released last week.
So if I can tie the two comments that you both made together, is it fair to say that there has been a maturation of the understanding that cyber obviously is more than just emails, that it's more than just, you know, the computer, and that as Stephen, as you rightly mentioned, whether you're talking about critical materials or critical infrastructure or trade, all of those now have heavily cyber, you know, elements to them. That it's not, you know, as neatly bifurcated as it was in the past. Maybe Stephen, start with you, then we'll go back to Danielle on that.
Well, everything we now do, in a sense, is wedded in the Internet of Things. So there was a point in time where you could say, well, we're on the internet, we're dealing with intellectual property, we're dealing with data, we're dealing with information. So we need to protect our data, protect our intellectual property. And then if you were the owner or the operator of a particular piece of infrastructure, you'd say, well, we're really concerned about operational technology. We really need to make sure that the operation of our technology can't be interfered with or can't be taken out of our hands. Now there's much more of a merging of all of these things, that IT leads to OT, that everyone now has a role to play in the Internet of Things. And as a consequence, at some level, whether you're an individual, whether you're a company in business or industry or a university, or whether you're a government of the day, a government agency, government department, you have a role to play, and you're also at some degree, at some level, at risk. So all of these things are interrelated. And that's one of, I think, the changes of approach. As you say, there was a time when you'd think, the emails that I send secure. Well, now it's not just emails, it's everything you do on your remote or digital device, doing everything from sending your IP to paying your bills. So it's all related now, and as a consequence, there's much more of a focus on, we need to make sure that at graduated levels, this is secure for the user, both in terms of the services which are provided, the products which are used, and the way in which people are at risk of being attacked for whatever reason.
There you go.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen, but so that I don't just repeat what he says, I think the way I look at it, being at ASPI and based in Canberra, is you can see over the last 4 or 5 years how much across the public service and in a bit of a whole of government fashion, we've seen an enormous change in resourcing this space. And not just cyber security or online safety, but I think cyber across the board. So, 5 years ago, there were very few government departments or agencies who had dedicated policy offices focused on cyber beyond, ASD and the ACSC aside. But within the last couple of years, you've seen a lot of these departments and agencies put together dedicated policy teams. So obviously you have them at DFAT who are doing really great and important work. You now have bigger teams at Home Affairs, PM&C, across the intelligence community, although obviously they're less policy focused. But you now see this, you sort of see it spread across in a way that I feel like international and global issues spread across the public surface 10 or 15 years ago. And I think it's actually a really good time for the strategy to come out, because if you look at the last couple of years, there was lots of positive activity going on, but a bit of a lack of leadership and focus. And that's something I think that if the strategy is implemented well, and I'm a bit of a government strategy skeptic, I will admit, but if implementation is good, I think that strategy can help pull all these disparate bits together and push them into one direction.
Thanks. In late June, you co-authored with some of your colleagues there at ASPI an excellent report entitled What, Who and Why, Explaining the Cyber Attacks Against Australia. Now, whenever in the think tank community you write a report, you really hope that somebody reads it. Clearly, somebody read that report, because just a month later, the Prime Minister launched formally, just last week actually, on the 6th of August, Australia's Cybersecurity Strategy 2020. Not taking full credit for it, but I'd like you to kind of give your reactions to that now being bumped up rather than to from a specific defense or home affairs issue to kind of a national level strategy.
Yeah, I don't think those two things are linked. I wish they were, but yeah, I think the strategy's been going on for a really long time. I thought it was, it only came out on Thursday or Friday, right? So it's very new, and I did read it over the weekend, and I hope I absorbed some of it. I thought it was a really good, solid strategy. It was very different to the strategy in 2016, I thought, that came out under Prime Minister Turnbull from PM&C. This one to me was more narrowly focused. And probably had less vision than that 2016 one. But criticisms of that 2016 one was that the implementation was a little bit patchy, and maybe it covered too many things. I think also when you have changing prime ministers and ministers, they don't always take up and implement someone else's strategy. So I think that played into that. The focus for me, and I'm really keen for Stephen's point of view, because my guess is he'll be thinking about it from more of a critical infrastructure perspective, but I really thought that the focus was cyber safety, and that came out again and again and again. I thought there were some good initiatives. It was really valuable to see, I thought, dollar figures and data against some of those initiatives. Previously, strategies on all kinds of topics have come out. They haven't always had funding attached, and the initiatives have been very vague, whereas I thought most of these initiatives were explained quite well, and I thought were really helped by the industry panel report that came out before, that I thought was a really neat tie-up, and actually strategies that sort of come out in future. I think I thought that was really valuable to have that in advance with the recommendations, and I actually really enjoyed reading that industry report, and I can't say that about many government strategies. So I thought that linkage was important. The one thing I did think it got bogged down a bit in the cyber safety piece, and I was sort of reading the strategy wanting to be lifted up a little bit more globally, and it didn't really talk much about a DFAT in the strategy, if at all, and that might have been very deliberate, because DFAT will have its own sort of international cyber engagement strategy coming out at another time. But I did think it was a little bit inward looking. Key for me will be the implementation. I mean, we've seen so many government strategies come out that, huge amounts of work went into them. They looked really glossy. Teams have worked so hard, especially leading up to putting them together, and have put in these enormous hours, and they go online, and within a few months you can just see that the implementation's not actually happening, or it's happening in some places, but senior public servants have moved on. There's a different minister, or maybe there's not a minister in charge. It's not enough funding, so there's no momentum. So I think the key bit will be implementation, and actually the industry report really highlights that as a really important area, and has had recommendations for how the implementation should go, and an advisory board, and there should be sort of milestones. And I thought that was really, really valuable, actually.
Stephen, you've been involved in both the formulation and, more importantly, as a minister, the dissemination of similar reports in the past, or strategies in the past. I'd welcome your insights on this most recent effort coming out of the Prime Minister.
Well, I think probably in 2011 or 2012, I launched on behalf of what was then DSD, the Defence Signals Directorate, the first, to my memory, paper that we put out on cybersecurity, and the sole intent of the work we put out was to start to get business and industry to begin to appreciate there were issues here that they needed to address. And since that point in time, we've changed Defence Signals Directorate to the Australian Signals Directorate. What was an organisation that was almost exclusively devoted to signals and telephone and mobile telecommunications, now in basically a decade, has essentially its orientation aimed at cybersecurity and the Internet of Things. So this has been a very fast development. And the 2020 cybersecurity strategy is, in my view, much more comprehensive than what we saw in 2016, some short sort of 4 years ago. I think as a general proposition, the two documents that Danielle has referred to, so firstly, the Industry Advisory report, which came out some time ago, and the cybersecurity strategy document released last week, they're both for anyone who's interested in this area, either someone in a government department who wants to be knowledgeable, a policymaker, or someone in business or commerce. It's well worth reading both of these documents. One of the good things about the cybersecurity strategy is that the more that you read it, the more good and forward-leaning things you find. So it's a strategy document, so you can be forgiven for not expecting too much detail. And it certainly, particularly in the critical infrastructure area, shows that the government has got, and the relevant departments have got, more work and more documentation to produce, including legislation. So we're clearly seeing here a work in progress. One of the good things about the strategy is that it does seek to be comprehensive, to address all aspects of cybersecurity and the need for it at different levels, individuals, business and industry, and government, but also different perspectives, critical infrastructure, safety, online content, and the like. The Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton, has made it very clear that he has a particular keenness and interest in organised crime and the capacity for organised crime to use cyber and the Internet of Things, particularly the dark web, to essentially affect very serious criminal offences, which historically we've only ever seen affected person to person. And so I think that's one of the reasons why there's one focus on that area of activity, and that's not a bad thing, but that's the area that the Minister has made clear publicly that he has most interest in. So there's a body of work there. Then there's a body of work on critical infrastructure, but there's also a body of work which essentially says, if we as a nation are to get through the difficulties and the risks of cybersecurity, then we've got to be dealing with that together. We have to be dealing with it at different levels, and there are different graduations of risks and different ways in which those risks can be ameliorated or reduced. And so if, for example, you're the government, then the strategy makes it clear that the government's job is essentially to protect the government's crown jewels. In other words, what are the key things here which we must protect, which, if they're subject to attack, can have very deleterious social and economic and national consequences. And there's a focus there on national critical infrastructure. At the same time, there is what are the risks which individuals might face in their use of data and digital equipment in the course of every day, and how do you protect them? And for the first time, we're now seeing an Australian government start to talk in terms of the need for there to be consumer protection in this area, just as there's consumer protection in all of the areas of activities of livelihood. And so notions for the first time of we now need to start holding manufacturers accountable for the sorts of cybersecurity protections that are in products and services. So there's an array of policy initiatives here. And I think, as Danielle says, you can flick through the 60-odd general recommendations in the advisory group's report, the 60-odd recommendations in the cybersecurity strategy. But the key will be in the implementation. What new voluntary codes of conduct will we find? What detail will be in the legislation which is aimed at protecting critical infrastructure? What new obligations will be placed on the boards of companies to ensure that they are treating their cybersecurity risks appropriately? Will that be on the same level as financial risks and accountability and the like? So there is a whole body of work there that cuts across 3 or 4 different strands, all of which we have to regard as a work in progress. And I think Danielle's right. The implementation as we go of this strategy will be crucial. On the international front, it's true that there's a small section on Australia continuing to want to play its role internationally in this area, but I expect that we'll probably see further work on this front, either from DFAT or Australia's Ambassador for Cybersecurity. But there are some mentions of our international obligations and the need to see further work done on the international rules of the road in this area.
I'm going to come right back to the final point that Stephen made, in that I'd like to turn the conversation more towards foreign policy, the foreign policy implications of these international relations implications of the cyber issues we've been discussing. But before I do that, I note that we've already got a number of questions that were submitted by people who registered in advance. We're delighted that almost 200 people from 13 different countries have registered to watch this event live, and many more will be watching it in its recorded format. For those watching it live right now, if you want to, you can use the chat button down at the bottom of the screen to raise live questions that we can discuss over the course of the next half hour. But turning back to foreign policy, Stephen, you referenced the efforts of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to kind of look at the policy implications in our foreign policy. If I recall correctly, last year, the year prior, we had Toby Feakin, who was the Ambassador for Cybersecurity Policy, come out and visit us. My recollection is that you gave him a hard time because the map in his rather glossily produced DFAT publication about the Indo-Pacific ended at Indonesia and didn't go into the Indian Ocean, didn't include Perth, and didn't include India. But more broadly, there obviously are some real implications for how we engage with our near neighbors, as well as global partners like the United States in this. So maybe, Stephen, could we start off with you talking about what are the foreign policy elements of the issues that you and Danielle have already discussed so well for us? What are the areas where do you think we ought to be prioritizing or focusing?
Well, firstly, Toby does a very good job as ambassador. He's not the first and won't be the last Commonwealth official who's been scarified by me for not paying sufficient attention to the Indo side of the Indo-Pacific, but that's a separate issue. But just as there are so many issues and problems that nations face these days which can't be dealt with just by one country alone, whether it's climate change, whether it's COVID-19, cyber is the same. In the end, you can do a whole range of things as a nation or as a government of a nation state to protect your citizens and to protect your security and economic interests. But in the end, you also have to cooperate and work with other countries. And so a starting point for that from Australia's perspective has always been in this area, because there are security consequences and implications. Our starting point is with Five Eye countries. But as we move into a much more multipolar way with the rise of India as a great power, the rise of Indonesia as a global influence, not just a regional influence, it is very important for Australia to start now dealing at a greater level with India and Indonesia and other countries, Japan, for example, in this space. And particularly with Indonesia and India, where you've got very digital savvy countries and constituencies, excuse me, there is a very important need for us to make those further connections, not just with our traditional Five Eyes countries.
Danielle, it's always a bit humbling for me as head of the Perth USAsia Centre to realize that the Cybersecurity Policy Centre that you're the deputy director of there of ASPI is about twice the size of our entire organization. But my guess would be that the work of the 30-odd people in your team is heavily skewed towards one country in particular, which is often in the foreign policy vernacular it's referred to as certain countries. But it really involves some of the particular challenges in the Australia-China relationship. So would you start there about the Australia-China relationship, the particular areas of cyber that are dominating your team's interest, and then anything more broadly among those that Stephen mentioned that you want to talk about as well?
Yeah, the team doesn't just focus on cybersecurity. We do a lot on emerging critical technologies, and we have quite a big team now on online information operations and disinformation. So the China bit's big too. Probably 30% of what we do ends up focusing on China. And even for those who don't focus on China and work on very different topics, China sort of looms large or comes into the topic anyway. Yeah, look, if you think about, I mean, I won't talk broadly about the China-Australia relationship, but if we think about the types of things that are coming up just in this field, things like the global expansion of China's technology companies has been a really interesting topic that we now see going mainstream, not because they're expanding and getting a lot of market share, because that's been happening for years, and I think has that's been, I think, quite quiet in a way, depending on what company it is, with the exception of Huawei. But we're now seeing that take on the main stage because of, I think, some of the decisions being made by the White House, as I said before, around WeChat and TikTok. And then, of course, the global 5G debate, which just never goes away and has continued for at least 2 years. And Australia was right out in front there and absolutely made the right decision in mid-2018. That decision upset, the Chinese Communist Party, but I think there was really no other way that decision was going to go. And you now see countries in all different stages of that decision. And it's really interesting trying to keep on top of the 5G debate in Europe, where you see countries coming to a very similar decision, but in different ways, where they now recognise that there are high-risk vendors in this space, and they will come up with a list that a vendor has to agree to when they enter the 5G market. And there are things that a company like Huawei cannot meet in terms of transparency of the company. There's a lot about, country of origin requirements. And it's really interesting to see 5 years ago, not really on, I'm not talking about 5G now, but in this sort of space, it was all about cost, and cost was a really important factor. But you now see national security considerations, geopolitical issues, and even human rights issues coming to the forefront. So on the human rights front, in the work that we do, you see more and more and more companies, Chinese companies, but also US companies as well, getting into big trouble for work they're doing in Xinjiang, or for companies that they're partnering with who are doing public security work in Xinjiang, which actually goes to things like supply chains as well. So, China looms large in everything in this space. I mean, one of the really important, I think, pieces of work that the Foreign Affairs Department will have to do going forward, to bounce off some of Stephen's points, and they're already doing this, is in the norms space, so cyber norms. But you can see over the next few years how much more important things like norms around artificial intelligence, surveillance technologies and public security. There's two things going on there in the Indo-Pacific that I think are really interesting. One is that China has skewed its Exim Bank loan system towards ICT and cyber and technology issues, as one would expect. So across the Indo-Pacific and developing countries, we've seen a lot of large Exim Bank funded projects coming in, that are public security technology heavy. At the same time, across the Indo-Pacific, all countries are bringing in new types of surveillance because of COVID. So we have, our tracking app, for example. Other countries in Asia have ankle bracelets or more invasive apps and data collection going on. So one thing to worry about, I think, is next year and the year after and the year after that is, will some countries keep some of those, surveillance technologies in place because they're super convenient to have apps that give you more data and show us more about what the population is doing. So having those norms debate at the United Nations and other multilateral bodies by our diplomats, I think, is going to get more and more important.
I wonder if we might take a little bit of a step back and focus specifically on the 5G that you mentioned several times there. For the average consumer, 5G is just the next generation of mobile phone, right? Faster, better. But obviously in the cybersecurity space, it has much deeper ramifications. One of the questions we got in advance was from Ben Halton, who's at Government House here in Western Australia. And he asked, how will 5G change the cyber landscape? And then a very insightful question. He says, would it likely provide redundancy for Australia's internet sea cables, or would it pose a greater threat or a greater number of security concerns? So would you start with kind of 5G, maybe a little bit of a primer, and then the particular elements that make it more complex, including the question that Ben raised there. Maybe Danielle, we'll start with you, then go back to Stephen on that. Yeah,
sure. So, 5G will offer us quicker speeds, lower latency. The concerns about 5G is that as it rolls out, and at the moment it's only in urban sort of hotspots, it means that there are more vectors to access us with. So if you think about, as Stephen said before, the Internet of Things, as our households become connected and we have smart fridges, I don't have one, but I know a lot of people do, connected baby monitors, connected speakers, personal assistants, you name it, connected garage door openers, and as all of these things are almost certainly going to be connected up via 5G, the threat landscape, I think, is bigger. And I think it was former Director General of ASD, Mike Burgess, who made good points about 5G and that it will also underpin our critical infrastructure. So it is very different to 4G. I've lost track. So that was a primer. What was the follow? Oh, undersea cables.
Yeah. Is it redundancy for that, or is it actually greater exposure from an Australian perspective?
I don't think it will make undersea cables obsolete, and I'm basing that off a couple of things. One thing is large US technology and internet companies are consistently investing in undersea cables. If you look at just the Indo-Pacific, they're still laying new undersea cables now to connect up a lot of their data centres in the region. My guess is that it will be different for all types of companies and sectors. A lot of people are talking about whether internet satellite will make different types of connections redundant, and there'll be this constellation of sort of internet satellites out there. My guess is that you'll need a combination and then it will really depend on what you need it for. But no, I don't think undersea cables are going anywhere anytime soon.
Thanks. Stephen, any reaction to the broader debate over 5G?
Well, firstly, if we sort of rewind a bit, because I think it's important to make a sort of a consistent policy point about Australian conduct. Lots of attention in the modern era is given to Australia's decision on 5G network and Huawei. We made exactly the same decision as a nation back in 2009, 2010 with respect to the NBN. So you put those two decisions together, it's essentially a nation state saying, we think it's important for us to be able to rely upon our critical telecommunications systems and protect our citizens, our national security interests and our national economic interests. So we've had a consistent course of policy approach to this, which is any country is entitled to take whatever steps it wants to, reasonable steps to protect the infrastructure basis of its telecommunications and its communications systems. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we're certainly with 5G and and our fixed assets, whether it's NBN, copper still existing somewhere, or ADSL, or submarine sea cables. I think we are destined to have, plus low orbiting satellites and the like, we're destined to have a combination of pieces of infrastructure, which on the one hand will make it easier for people to communicate, because different locations will lend itself to different types of communication systems. But at the same time, will particularly as you bounce from one system to another, will open up greater risk and the need for greater focus of attention on the various different vectors that we're using. So, like Danielle, I don't see a redundancy of the sea cables. We'll continue, I think, to see a multiplicity of devices and methods of getting data from one space to another, and the cybersecurity threat is not a static thing. It will continue to develop, and the techniques will continue to enhance, whether the state actor or the non-state actor is acting out of an intelligence motivation, a criminal motivation, or is just a young kid in the garage wanting to hack to see what he or she can do. The risk will continue to be there, and the risk will continue to evolve, whatever the data platform is that we're using, or the operational technology platform that we're using.
If we think back to the early heady days of the internet, there was this narrative that, the internet more broadly, increasing cyber capabilities were going to render nation states and national borders obsolete. And then for the better part of the last 15 years, the focus really has been on the creation of almost a separate internet internally within China, behind the Great Firewall of China. In recent days, as there have been national actions against not just Huawei, but very recently, as you mentioned, TikTok and WeChat, et cetera, there's been a number of alarmist voices that are concerned about creating two internets. I saw an interesting comment on Twitter just over the weekend that says, this has been a reality for a long time, right? Whereas at this point, there are countries in the West that may have banned those three sites or those three capabilities. For the better part of the last 15 years, these now very large and very wealthy Chinese companies have been built in an environment where there has been no competition, where they're shielded from competition from Google and from Apple and from Facebook and all the other international things, just because they're blocked and not allowed within China. So the question that I have in that current environment is one that comes from Peter Yankov, who's a well-known company director here in Western Australia. And he asked a question that at its core may have been inspired by that famous quote, at least me coming from Washington, D.C., from George Washington, that says, the best defense is a good offense. So Peter writes, real defense means one understands as well offense. This applies to cybersecurity. To what extent do our cyber defense capabilities rely on being able to have a meaningful offensive counterattacks by comparison to other major cyber actors internationally? So I know we're getting a little bit more into the hard security area here, but is there a proactive element to cybersecurity rather than just sitting here and protecting our infrastructure, protecting our firms, our information? Is there an offensive part of this discussion that we're not talking about? Stephen, maybe we'll start with you on that front.
Well, firstly, when it comes to offensive cyber, just make this sort of admonition at the outset, which is, this is something which individual consumers, business and industry should not dabble with. This is something to be left to government and government agencies. So I just make that sort of point first up. But we've already seen over the last decade or so a progression of government and government agencies not just looking at cybersecurity as a defensive proposition, but also within the law, an offensive proposition. So it's already on the record. I'm not breaching any confidential information here, that in the course of Australia's time in Afghanistan, cybersecurity techniques were utilised by the Australian Defence Force in Afghanistan to interfere with online and digital communications amongst the Taliban. So that's one area where it's used in a warlike circumstance or situation. In the cybersecurity strategy released last week, the government is making it clear that it sees a role for offensive capability in limited circumstances to some government agencies. And over the weekend, you saw in the news the AFP commissioner indicating that it's not beyond thinking that AFP might well put officers overseas into different capital cities with people working on cyber issues overseas. ASD, as it's now called, of course, does not have a domestic mandate, but I expect the government is looking very carefully at what should be the limit of the ASD's domestic mandate when dealing with protection of critical infrastructure, when dealing with its relationship with the Australian Federal Police, with Criminal Intelligence Commission and the like. So I think this will be an area of some policy focus in the future. Our other offshore intelligence agency, ASIS, again, not allowed to operate domestically. Some people have suggested that ASD should not be allowed to operate domestically. Well, the logical extension of that, if you need, from a national security or national interest point of view, to protect a domestic circumstance, you can send half of ASD down to Asia, and that solves your sort of mandate problem. I think life's a bit more complex and complicated than that, and we will be looking at what capacity will we give ASD with limited government agencies to operate domestically, and what authority will we give ASD and other government agencies, particularly those aimed at organised crime and the dark web and the like, to operate in a limited but nonetheless offensive way. So I think Peter is quite right. And as you've put it, often offence is the best form of defence. It needs to be dealt with carefully. There needs to be clear legislative authority to do so. And it needs to be left in the hands of the experts, namely ISD, Defence and our key crime agencies. It's not something, in my view, for individual companies or for individuals to dabble with, not in the least because under current Australian law, it would be unlawful to so do.
Thanks. Danielle, anything to add from that?
Just a little bit. Yeah, I agree with Stephen. I do think this should be left to the government, but of course companies do dabble in this space from all around the world. I think I was just actually Googling as Stephen was talking when we first announced that we had offensive cyber capabilities. And I think the Australian government might well have been the first government to ever announce that around the world back in maybe 2016. And I think Prime Minister Turnbull announced it, that I think he said cyber offensive capabilities will be directed at organised offshore cyber criminals. And it has expanded a little bit beyond there. Look, I think it's a really important capability to have. I think most countries with the signals, intelligence and cyber function will have this capability. And as long as it's used carefully and in proportion and under the scrutiny of Parliament, I think it's a good thing. I do think it would be good, and actually the government is doing this more and more, and even Prime Minister Scott Morrison coming out recently talking about the sort of cyber campaign targeting, the Australian government and companies and critical infrastructure. I think it's important to just explain these things to the public so they do know where the boundaries are, what's happening, that the focus is offshore criminals or in wartime or, these sectors. I think sometimes things happen in this space that are sort of well known in the public service and in Canberra, but because there's been one media release and very few people read that media release and it might not get a lot of pickup, it isn't well explained. And I do think when it comes to cyber and technology issues, and also China issues, and especially when they involve both, which they often do these days, it's really important that different parliamentarians come out and talk to the public about all these issues, no matter if they're sensitive or not. And I do think it was really good to see Prime Minister Morrison sort of come out recently and talk about these things because they're only getting, as we talked about before, under COVID, things are only sort of sharpening in this space, and there is only more and more going on.
I wonder if I might now turn to the intersection between technology and investment, because when we were talking about earlier the NBN or 5G, and not just in Australia, 5G in other countries around the world too, the decision to ban Huawei wasn't based entirely just on technology, but the nature of the companies involved in the technology, the legal underpinning behind those companies, and then in many cases, you know, the resources that came with them and the relative dependence that came alongside those resources. I have a question from our Director of Research at the Perth USAsia Centre, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, who asks, how do emerging cybersecurity challenges intersect with recently announced changes to Australia investment rules or regime, specifically the current proposal to introduce a new national security test in addition to the national interest? So I think we saw some early previews to this in the Ausgrid decision, but I think increasingly if foreign investment is going to be looked at through the realm of this increasingly sensitive sector. Stephen, do you have any initial thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's right. I think if you track back the question of foreign investment into potential important or critical infrastructure really arose publicly with discussion over the granting of the lease to Darwin Port, and as a consequence of that being an issue of public comment, public controversy, governments have progressively made further changes to the system and proposed changes to the foreign investment system, which make it incumbent upon the board and officials and the treasurer to be looking carefully at implications for critical infrastructure and vital infrastructure. And I think there's more work to be done in this space as well, but I think you've seen the chair of the Foreign Investment Review Board, David Irvine, the former ASIS and ASIO Director General, making the point on a number of occasions that one of the things which he thinks we need to look more at is data and how we're protecting data and what implications there are for data protection with various foreign investments. The same applies with critical infrastructure. This will be an area which will just grow, and I wouldn't be surprised to see further government regulation or legislation in this area when we see the further critical infrastructure legislation emerge in due course.
Yeah, I just add that without talking specifically about those changes you outlined, I think it points to the fact that, well, two things, all technology is multi-use. Secondly, country of origin issues really matter today. So whether a foreign government potentially has extrajudicial control or influence over a particular company seeking to invest here is really important. The national security and intelligence and counter-espionage laws of a foreign state whose companies are seeking to invest here matters. And of course, with a lot of this, we're really talking about China, and there's a number of examples we have where China is using laws in an extrajudicial capacity, and we can see that right now in Hong Kong. A really interesting example, which didn't get much attention but had a cyber element to it, was a couple of years ago when the Chinese state went around writing to airline companies around the world saying that they had broken China's cybersecurity law by describing Taiwan on their website as, where are you going to a trip? Taiwan, as opposed to Taiwan, China. And they were referring to international websites, not domestic websites. And so they wrote to all of these companies who I think some initially pushed back, but at the end of the day, I think almost all airlines ended up falling in line and changing the way they described Taiwan simply because they were told that it breaks China's cybersecurity law. Apparently it actually doesn't, but it doesn't matter, right? If you need a sort of government to sort of back you up there. And I think even US airlines ended up, the Chinese government gave them a particular date to which they had to change that on their websites. And US airlines, I think, waited till right at the end, and the US government sort of backed them in. And then eventually I think they just went, right, this is in the too hard basket. And, we are worried about potentially breaking these laws, even though it's overseas. And from what I understand, all airlines changed the way they described Taiwan simply because of that. So that extrajudicial nature, I think, of how the CCP uses its laws overseas is really concerning, and it absolutely flows into this foreign investment space.
Your final example highlights some of the fundamental challenges of the current era that we're in, right? Because my guess, if those same airlines were making that decision today, it would be far less relevant because none of them are flying to China. So I wonder if I might ask a final question, which came in from a lot of both current viewers and those who wrote in beforehand, and that is understanding, if it's possible at this early date, the implications of the COVID-19 era on cybersecurity more broadly. Now, there is a bit of a truism out there that whatever was happening beforehand, COVID made it faster and worse. But I really haven't seen a lot of thinking about what that means for the cyber realm. So if you could think just a little bit about where we are right now, where you think we're likely to go in terms of a global response to this pandemic, and how that overlays with the issues that you're working with in cybersecurity specifically, but in cyber more broadly. So tough question, I realize, but it's a great way to wrap it up. Danielle, why don't we start with you, then we'll go to Stephen on that one.
That's a huge question. And I'm trying to think through what I haven't already said, so I don't just give a sort of an answer I've already touched on. I think COVID to me, well, there's so many things going on, but one thing I'd finish on is I think what's happened is there's no distinction, I think, anymore between online and offline lives, and between, at least for us in Australia and in developed countries, and between, work from home and work in the office. So from a cybersecurity perspective, that makes things incredibly complicated. I'm here at home now, and then I'll go into my office tomorrow, and then I'll come back home. And I think the way that workforces change, instead, this isn't going to be a long-term change. A lot of companies are now saying, right, everybody work from home from now on. So it's going to completely, I think, reshape workforces and different economies. And I think that's going to take us a while to grapple with. That's one thing. The second thing is, to me, it shows how important technology policy is. And we're on top of, we have a cybersecurity strategy. The government's doing really, I think, well, and there's really positive momentum around that. We don't have a technology policy, and I'm never really sure which government department is leading on the technology space. And I think that's the next thing we have to move to. Thank you, Stephen. Any final observations on that?
Yep. I just want to reinforce a point that Danielle made, and then I'll give a final observation on your question. We shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that China is the only actor in the cybersecurity space. So there are plenty of governments with the capability of acting in this area: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Israel. There's a whole range of prospective state-based actors, and when state-based actors engage in persistent and ongoing activity, then from time to time, a country like Australia, you've got to get your timing right, you've got to get the weight right, but from time to time, it does help to call institutions out, to call nation states out. But we shouldn't forget that there are lots of non-state actors out there, organised crime, ransomware, kidnappers and the like, who've got very high capability in this space. So this is not just one particular nation. On the final takeout, I think, without being nationalistic or protectionist, I think one of the things which COVID has taught us is we've got to take a very serious look at where are our supply chains in a whole range of areas, and where do we need to have either diverse and secure supply chains and or a domestic capability. And in cyber, I think one of the lessons from COVID is that Australia must have, separate from ASD, so separate from government, it must have its own capable cybersecurity industry. Government can't do everything. ASD can protect the crown jewels and protect key things. But for a country like Australia, living in the modern era, if you want your citizens and your economy to be safe in general terms and to minimise the risk, you must have a capable domestic sovereign Australian industry. And if I had one criticism about the cybersecurity strategy, it would be that whilst you find that notion implied in a number of initiatives, whether it's skills and training or additional jobs in ASD for cyber savvy people. The one thing which the government has not articulated is that post-COVID, to protect our economic and our security interests, in addition to a world-class ASD, which we have, we must have a capable, sovereign, domestic-based Australian cybersecurity industry to do all of the work out there, which government simply doesn't have the resources or the time to do while it's protecting the crown jewels and the critical infrastructure.
It may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but for me personally, one of the measures of a good conversation like this is that I end the hour with far more questions than I had at the beginning of the hour, which means that the level of nuance in the conversation made me realize just how little I know and how complex the issue is. And obviously, I'm not alone in that sentiment. We have just a large number of questions that were submitted at registration, which we didn't get to, as well as a number that came online. So Walter Purio, Tim Shanahan, Hendo Fujiono, and a number of others. We're sorry that we have time to get to your questions, but we appreciate you taking the time to join us. More broadly, we really appreciate you, Danielle, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. We look forward to your continuing stream of assessments coming out of ASPI and out of Canberra. And Stephen, thank you for your service as a director, as a distinguished fellow with the center, and your leadership, not just nationally, but on the firm level on these issues as we go forward. On behalf of the Perth USAsia Centre, thank you all for joining us. We hope this has been a useful conversation for you all, and we look forward to having you join us at future foreign policy conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.